Okay, so today we're going to talk about how the light affects objects. And here you will be able to see the separations of values. So there will be six separations of values in these objects, and I'm going to point them out to you. Okay, so first thing that I want you all to notice is that the light will affect different objects differently. So if you look at these geometric objects in front of you, one's like this sort of cube here that has more angles or angular planes, you'll notice that the values are quite dramatic. So this is fairly light, this one is a little bit darker, and then here is fairly dark. So it's quite dramatic. Whereas curvilinear forms like the cylinder and this container here, it feels like the values are more subtle, like there's a gradation of values, and the separations are not so dramatic as in the cube with the angles. Okay, so that's something that you should pay attention to when you are drawing. So even in some of these cloths that's more organic, the folds, they are more curvilinear, so there's a gradation of values that happen throughout the cloth. Okay, so the six separations of values, and you learned this already in drawing one, are as follows. Okay, so when you look at the still life, you notice this super bright area here. And these super bright areas are called the highlight. And that basically is the brightest area on an object when it's being illuminated by light. And so if you think about it, highlight of a party, highlight of a concert, it's like the most extreme. And so here you have something that's super bright. Okay, and this is normally caused by the light hitting at it at an angle. And also, if you notice that any object with sort of a shiny surface, like a glossy object or metallic object or glassy object, will definitely have that highlight. Okay, so things that are more matte or more texture, you won't be able to see it as well. So the next separation of value would be called the light area, which is the area that's around the highlight. So if you look, and some of these may not be as obvious, but here if you look, this would be this, there's no highlight here, there's a highlight right here. So around it is called the light area. This would be called the light area. Okay? So what does that mean? It means that it's the light areas around the highlight which is not as bright as the highlight. Okay? Then the third separation of value is this really dark spot here on this can. So here, this is something called core of shadow. So one thing that I want you guys to know is that when you read books or you look at certain things on the internet, it may have different names for different separations of values. So some might call it midtones and so on and so forth. But just that's fine. They have different terms, but know that there are all these separations of values that you should look out for when you look at the objects that are illuminated by a light source. So here is this really dark area on an object called core of shadow, and you should be able to see it here as well. Okay, from where I'm standing, I see it right here. And if you have a hard time looking at the values when you look at these objects, make sure you squint. In that way, you're controlling the amount of light that goes into your eyes, and you're activating your cells in your eyes, and so you'll be able to see your values much clearer. Okay, so if you look at this, core of shadow happens because the light is traveling in parallel rays and it cannot turn around the object, so it's just moving in parallel rays, and as the object turns away from the light source, it goes into shadow, and that's why you have this core of shadow right there. Okay, and what is important to note is the fourth separation of value, which is this sort of fuzzy area here. And the reason why I'm pointing to this can so much than the other objects is because this one is very obvious here. There's this sort of fuzzy area here before it gets into the core of shadow. This fuzzy area here is called shadow. And it's really important when you shade, because in order to make it look 3D, you need to put this fuzzy area down on your drawing because it bridges the gap between the light area and the dark area. So it creates a nice transition from the light area into the shadow area. If you have this if you have this shadow next to the core of shadow, you will then be able to create a nice gradation of values that will help in making the object look three-dimensional. Okay, so then you have the fifth separation of value, which is something called reflected light. So if you're looking at the object, here you'll notice this sort of bright glow in the shadow area. And this is called reflected light. And why does that happen? Because the light source, the rays from the light source will hit its surrounding surface and then bounce back into the shadow area, creating this reflected light. Okay, so it feels like there's this glow in the shadow. And you can see if I put my hand next to it, you'll notice that there's almost like a warm tone, sort of pinkish color on the object itself because the light is hitting my palm and then bouncing into the shadow area, giving it that warm hue. Okay?
Yes.
So,
Question.
yes.
What do you mean by warm?
So, like if you look, it looks kind of pinkish, because the color is actually being reflected back.
All right. And what would a cool light be? Or are there any warm versus cool?
Well, right now, if you put something else in there, that could create a coolness to it. Right now, it's because my hand is really warm because there's blood flowing underneath it. So now you have this warm color that bounces back into the can. So sometimes when students will be shading, they'll look at the reflected light and they think, wow, that reflected light is really, really strong. So let me put a lot of white as I'm using my white charcoal and I'm shading. Let me add quite a bit of white in that reflected value area of the can. Please don't do that because remember, it's reflected light. So this area here can never be as bright as the light area that is facing the light source. Okay, because it's receiving direct light from the light source, whereas this is receiving light that's reflected off another object and bouncing into the shadow area. And the reason why it looks bright and sometimes it looks super bright is because it is next to a dark area. So everything is relative. So that being looks really, really light because again, it's sitting next to a dark value. Okay. Then the final separation of value will be something called cast shadow. And you can see here where it's cast by an object. All right. And so if you notice that the cast shadow, if you're drawing, it is super, super dark, but just make sure that you don't fill it in entirely with a black value or dark value. You don't want it to be an even darkness because if you do that, then if you shade it very evenly and you make it really, really dark, it will look flat. It'll look like a hole, like a void, or a void. So you don't want to do that. You want to make sure that there is a little bit of light filtering through that cast shadow so that it has almost that transparency quality to it and it'll make it look more believable as a cast shadow. So here you'll notice too that there's reflector light right there. Okay, so if you were to shade, you can put a little bit of white, but don't put a lot of white in there. It looks pretty bright and it looks glowy because it's sitting next to or surrounded by dark areas, okay, or dark values. So again, notice the difference. If you look at the cube, you'll notice that the shift in values is very dramatic. Light, a little bit darker, and really kind of dark, and this really nice crisp edge. And then you look at the cylinder and you look at this, the transition of values is very, very gradual. It's a nice gradation of values across the film. And notice also, even in a black object like this, you may not be able to see a highlight. Maybe there might be a hint of a very tiny highlight here, but really this is like the light area. And then you go into the core shadow. And this right here is really kind of fuzzy. Okay, and you have to squint, and that fuzzy area is the shadow area. So if you were to not include that, then it won't tie in this light area with this core shadow. So you need to put that shadow in. Okay, that's really, really important. Okay, and then here you'll notice that it's a little bit lighter in value. And again, that's reflected light. Why? Because the light is hitting these surrounding drapery and bouncing into the shadow area. Okay, and you'll notice too, like the cloth, and I can remove this quickly so you can see the fold in the cloth. So this is an organic form, but it serves like a curvature plane here. So you'll notice too very quickly that you'll have a light area here. You'll have this very distinct core shadow that's quite dark. And then you have this area here, which is a little bit darker than the light area, but not as dark as the core shadow. And that's the shadow area. So light, shadow, core shadow, and then you see this glow on the underside of that fold. That's the reflected light. Okay, and then in here it's probably the cast shadow right there. Okay, so you should be able to notice that on your objects. And sometimes when you have a shiny object or a glassy object, it's harder to see those separations of values, but it's okay, just pay attention to the values, see how they fall across the form and shade accordingly. But just know that reflected light, even though it's very bright, it can never be as bright, and you should never shade it as light as the light area. Okay, so I think if let's do something really quickly. If I add this next to it, I don't know, it might brighten that area, that reflected light. Does it?
A little bit.
Okay, so that's pretty much it.